Before I tell you this story, I need you to understand something. I'm not a vengeful man. I've built my life on integrity, hard work, and the belief that family comes first. What happened to me could happen to anyone, and maybe it already has happened to you. If you've ever trusted someone completely, only to discover they'd been betraying you all along, then you'll understand the choice I had to make. This is the story of how 20 years of marriage and a $2.3 million construction empire crumbled in a single afternoon, and how sometimes the best revenge is simply letting people destroy themselves. If you're watching this, hit that subscribe button and let me know where you're watching from. I'd love to hear from you. I still remember the weight of those anniversary roses in my hands as I pulled into our driveway that Tuesday afternoon. 24 red roses, one for each year we'd been together, including our 4 years of dating. Sarah always said I was sentimental to a fault, but after building a construction empire from nothing but calloused hands and determination, sentiment was what kept me grounded. The Chicago flight had landed 2 hours early, and I decided to surprise her. Our 20th anniversary deserved something special, something spontaneous. The champagne, Dom Perignon 2008, the same vintage from our wedding, sat cooling in the passenger seat beside a small velvet box containing diamond earrings that had cost more than my first truck. But as I turned into our circular driveway, my heart began to race for all the wrong reasons. Sarah's white BMW sat in its usual spot, but next to it, like a rusted scar against our manicured landscape, was Mark's beat-up Silverado. My brother's truck, with its faded paint and rattling exhaust, looked as out of place as it always did in our neighborhood of executive homes and pristine lawns. I checked my watch, 2:17 p.m. on a Tuesday. Sarah should have been at her yoga class. Mark should have been at whatever construction site I'd assigned him to this week, trying to prove he could handle responsibility without my constant supervision. The house stood before me like a monument to everything I'd built. 3 stories of custom stonework. Windows I'd selected and installed myself. A wraparound porch where Sarah and I used to drink coffee and plan our future. 20 years of sweat, sacrifice, and shared dreams made manifest in brick and mortar. I sat in my truck for a moment, engine ticking as it cooled, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe Mark had stopped by to borrow tools. Maybe Sarah had canceled her class. Maybe there was a perfectly innocent explanation for why my wife and my brother were alone in our house in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. The roses were already wilting in the heat, their petals beginning to curl at the edges like small dying prayers. I approached the front door with my key ready, but something made me pause. The house felt different, charged with an energy that made the hair on my neck stand up. Through the beveled glass, I could see Sarah's purse on the entrance table. Mark's work boots kicked carelessly against the wall. And then I heard it. Laughter. Sarah's laughter, but not the kind she shared with me anymore. This was breathless, intimate, tinged with something I hadn't heard from her in years. It drifted down the mahogany staircase I'd built by hand, each spindle turned in my workshop during the long winter evenings of our early marriage. My feet moved without conscious thought, carrying me up those stairs with the silence of a man who'd learned to walk quietly on construction sites. The roses trembled in my grip, their thorns drawing tiny pinpricks of blood from my palm. Our bedroom door, solid oak with brass hinges I'd installed myself, stood, slightly ajar. Through the gap, afternoon sunlight streamed across hardwood floors, illuminating a scene that would replay in my mind for months to come. Sarah, my wife of 20 years, was in our marriage bed with Mark, my younger brother, the man I'd given jobs to when no one else would hire him, the man I'd bailed out of debt more times than I could count. The smell hit me first. Sarah's perfume, Chanel No. 5, mixed with Mark's cologne and something else, something primal and betraying. The bed creaked with their movement, the same bed where Sarah and I had conceived our daughter, where we'd whispered dreams of growing old together, where I'd held her through 2 miscarriages and countless smaller griefs. They were so lost in each other that they never saw me standing there, roses dropping from nerveless fingers, 20 years of trust shattering like glass against stone. I backed away slowly, mechanically, my contractor's mind already cataloging evidence even as my heart broke. Mark's wallet on the dresser. Sarah's yoga clothes folded neatly on the chair. The clothes she wasn't supposed to be wearing because she wasn't supposed to be here. By the time I reached my truck, my hands had stopped shaking. As I sat there watching my world collapse, one thought crystallized with perfect clarity. They had no idea I'd seen them. That ignorance would become their downfall. The champagne had gone warm by the time Sarah started preparing our anniversary dinner that evening. I sat in my home office, watching her through the kitchen doorway as she moved through the familiar choreography of cooking, humming softly to herself. She wore a blue dress I'd bought her for her birthday, and she'd reapplied her makeup with the careful precision of a woman trying to erase the afternoon's evidence. The performance was flawless, and that's exactly what it was. A performance. "How was Chicago, honey?" she called out, her voice carrying that forced brightness I now recognized as the sound of guilt, trying to masquerade as innocent. "Productive," I replied, my fingers hovering over the keyboard of my computer. The Peterson contract came through, $3.2 million for the downtown hotel project. It was a lie, but I wanted to test something. Sure enough, Sarah appeared in the doorway within seconds, dollar signs practically gleaming in her eyes. 3.2? That's wonderful, David. We should celebrate. She kissed my cheek, and I caught that scent again, the lingering trace of betrayal beneath her familiar perfume. My brother's cologne, faint but unmistakable. As Sarah returned to the kitchen, I accessed our shared business accounts, fingers dancing across keys I'd used to build an empire. Miller Construction LLC, the company I'd started in our garage 23 years ago with a borrowed pickup truck and unshakable determination. Now it was worth $2.3 million in assets, with yearly revenues approaching $4 million. Every nail, every board, every contract had been earned through 16-hour days, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that comes from chasing the American dream with nothing but willpower and calloused hands. But as I scrolled through transaction records, my blood began to chill. Transfers to Mark's personal account. Small amounts at first, 500 here, 1,000 there. But they'd grown bolder over the past 6 months, the most recent, $18,000, authorized with my electronic signature just last week. I pulled up the signature authorization logs. According to the timestamps, I'd been in Milwaukee when that transfer was made, meeting with suppliers 300 miles away from my home office. Someone had forged my signature. Someone with access to our accounts, our office, our home. The dinner bell rang, its cheerful chime echoing through a house that suddenly felt like a mausoleum of broken promises. "Coming, sweetheart," I called, closing the laptop with deliberate care. Sarah had outdone herself. Our dining room table gleamed under the chandelier we'd chosen together 10 years ago, set with our wedding china and crystal glasses that caught the light like captured stars. Candles flickered between arrangements of white roses, not the red ones I'd dropped in our bedroom, but fresh white ones she must have picked up while I was discovering her betrayal. The irony wasn't lost on me. "To 20 wonderful years," Sarah said, raising her champagne flute. Her smile was radiant, her eyes bright with what I now understood was relief at having pulled off another deception. "To 20 years," I echoed, the words tasting like ash. As we ate, Sarah chattered about her day with the practiced ease of a seasoned liar. Her yoga class had been particularly challenging today. Apparently, they'd worked on deep stretches and breathing exercises. She described the instructor's new routine with enough detail to convince anyone who wasn't sitting across from her, knowing she'd spent the afternoon in bed with my brother. I nodded and smiled and played the role of devoted husband while my mind raced through the implications of what I'd discovered. This wasn't just about broken marriage vows. This was about 20 years of shared labor being systematically stolen by the two people I'd trusted most in the world. Between the main course and dessert, I excused myself to use the bathroom and made a quick detour to my office. A few more keystrokes revealed the full scope of the theft. Over the past year, nearly $180,000 had been transferred to Mark's accounts. Money that should have gone to equipment purchases, employee bonuses, the college fund we'd established for our daughter. Money that had instead funded my wife's affair with my brother. I returned to find Sarah lighting new candles, her face soft in the golden glow. She looked beautiful, almost ethereal, and for a moment I felt the old familiar tug of love and attraction. This was the woman I'd fallen in love with 24 years ago, the woman who'd stood beside me as we built something from nothing. But that woman was a ghost. The person sitting across from me was a stranger wearing her face. "I have something for you," I said, reaching for the velvet box I'd somehow managed to keep hidden all evening. Sarah's eyes widened as she opened it, revealing the diamond earrings that had cost $8,000, roughly half of what she and Mark had stolen just last month. "David, they're beautiful," she whispered, and for the first time all evening her emotion seemed genuine. "You shouldn't have spent so much." No, I thought, watching her fasten the earrings with trembling fingers. I shouldn't have. Later that night, as Sarah slept beside me in our violated bed, I stared at the ceiling and planned. My contractor's mind, trained to see problems and engineer solutions, began building a blueprint for justice. Mark had always been jealous of my success. Even as children, he'd resented any recognition I received, any achievement that outshone his own. Our parents had called it sibling rivalry, but I'd recognized it for what it truly was, the bitter resentment of a man who refused to do the work but wanted all the rewards. Now he was trying to take everything I'd built, using my own wife as an accomplice. But Mark had always been impulsive, short-sighted, prone to mistakes when he thought he was being clever. And Sarah, for all her careful planning, had never understood the intricacies of our business. She knew how to spend money, not how to hide its theft from someone who'd built the system she was stealing from. When I found the $180,000 in transfers to Mark's account, I understood this wasn't just about broken vows. They were stealing my life's work, and they had no idea I was about to make them pay for every stolen dollar, every betrayed trust, every lie told across our anniversary dinner table. The game had begun, and they didn't even know they were playing. At 3 a.m., when the house had settled into the deep silence that comes before dawn, I found myself standing in my workshop in the basement. This was my sanctuary, the place where I'd built my first construction projects, where I'd taught myself carpentry and electrical work through trial and error and sheer determination. The familiar smells surrounded me, sawdust and motor oil, the metallic tang of steel tools, the sweet scent of wood stain. My workbench, scarred by decades of use, held half-finished projects. A jewelry box I'd been making for Sarah's birthday, a birdhouse for our daughter's new apartment. Small acts of love suspended in time. I picked up my hammer, a 20-ounce Estwing I'd owned for over 20 years, and felt its familiar weight in my palm. For a moment, a dark thought flickered through my mind. How easy it would be to drive to Mark's apartment, to confront him with this tool I'd used to build everything he was trying to steal. But I set the hammer down gently, my hands steadier than they'd been all day. Violence wasn't the answer. Violence was what weak men resorted to when they lacked the intelligence to find a better way. Instead, I let myself feel the full weight of what I'd lost. Sarah and I had met when we were both 24, young and hungry, and convinced we could conquer the world together. She'd been working as a receptionist at an architectural firm. I'd been a carpenter with dreams of starting my own construction company. Our first date had been dinner at a diner that cost $12 for both of us, and I'd been so nervous I'd spilled coffee on my only good shirt. She'd laughed and dabbed at the stain with her napkin, and in that moment I'd fallen completely, irrevocably in love. We'd built our life together board by board, contract by contract. Sarah had kept the book. Yes, in those early days, working late into the night with receipts scattered across our kitchen table. When I'd land a big job, we'd celebrate with cheap champagne and dreams of the house we'd build someday. When times were lean, she'd stretch every dollar and never complained about the dinners of ramen noodles and canned soup. Or at least that's what I'd believed. Now I wondered how much of it had been real. Had she ever truly loved me, or had I simply been a means to an end? A hard-working fool who could provide the security and status she craved. The questions multiplied in the pre-dawn darkness, each one cutting deeper than the last. Mark's betrayal shouldn't have surprised me. My younger brother had always taken shortcuts, always looked for the easy path. When we were kids, he'd copy my homework. In high school, he'd borrowed money he never repaid. As adults, he'd drifted from job to job, always with an excuse, always with a scheme that was going to make him rich without effort. I'd given him chance after chance, bringing him into my company despite his failures, because that's what family did. That's what I believed family meant. But Sarah's betrayal cut to the bone. I'd trusted her with everything, my business, my heart, my future. I'd put her name on accounts, signed documents that gave her access to everything I'd built. I'd done it gladly, proudly, because I'd believed we were partners in every sense of the word. The workshop grew cold around me as the night deepened, but I barely noticed. I was lost in memories and regrets, cataloging every sign I'd missed, every lie I'd accepted at face value. Sarah's yoga classes that had increased in frequency over the past year. Mark's sudden interest in our business operations, his questions about contracts and cash flow. The distance that had grown between Sarah and me, subtle but persistent, like a hairline crack in a foundation that eventually brings down the entire structure. I'd attributed it to the natural evolution of a long marriage, the comfortable companionship that replaces passionate romance. I'd been a fool. Dawn was beginning to creep through the basement windows when I finally climbed the stairs back to the main floor. Through the kitchen window, I could see the construction site where we'd broken ground on our latest project, a luxury apartment complex that would add another $1 million to our company's value. Mark and I had stood on that empty lot 6 months ago discussing timelines and subcontractors. He'd clapped me on the shoulder and said, "We make a good team, big brother, always have." Even then, he'd probably been planning to steal it all. But as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and pink, I remembered something my mentor, old Bill Henderson, had told me when I was just starting out in construction. "The best revenge, son, is letting people destroy themselves. Give a fool enough rope and he'll hang himself every time. Give a thief enough opportunity and he'll take so much that even a blind judge can see his guilt." Bill had been talking about a subcontractor who'd been skimming materials from job sites, but the principle applied here as well. Mark and Sarah thought they were being clever, but they were actually being predictable. Thieves always got greedier, liars always got sloppier, and people who betrayed family always underestimated the lengths that family would go to protect what they'd built. I brewed coffee as the house began to wake around me, listening to Sarah's footsteps on the floor above. Soon she'd come downstairs, kiss me goodbye, and leave for another yoga class that would probably involve an afternoon in my brother's bed. But this time, I'd be ready. This time, I'd be documenting everything. The game had changed, and they didn't even know it. As dawn broke over the construction site we'd built together, I remembered something my mentor had taught me. The best revenge is letting them destroy themselves, and I was about to give them every opportunity to do exactly that. Harold Brennan's law office occupied the 32nd floor of a downtown Chicago high-rise, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of the city I'd helped build with my own hands. Harold and I had known each other for 30 years, ever since we'd played softball in the same recreational league back when we were both struggling to establish ourselves in our respective careers. He'd grown successful defending contractors and small business owners like me, while I'd grown successful building the structures that housed people's dreams. We'd shared bottles of bourbon over contract negotiations, celebrated each other's victories, and weathered each other's defeats. If anyone could help me navigate this nightmare, it was Harold. His secretary, Mrs. Chen, showed me into his oak-paneled office with its leather furniture and shelves lined with legal tomes. The morning sun slanted through Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across Harold's mahogany desk. "David," Harold rose from his chair, his weathered face creased with concern. At 62, he'd grown distinguished silver around the temples, but his handshake was still firm, his blue eyes still sharp as a prosecutor's blade. "You sounded terrible on the phone. What's going on?" I'd rehearsed this moment during the drive downtown, but sitting across from my oldest friend, the words stuck in my throat like sawdust. "Sarah's having an affair," I finally managed. Harold's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. "Jesus, David, are you sure? I caught them yesterday, in our bedroom." The words came easier now, as if speaking them aloud somehow made them more bearable. "With Mark." The coffee cup hit the desk with a sharp crack. "Mark? Your brother Mark? The same one I've been carrying for the past 10 years. The same one I made a partner in my company because Sarah insisted family comes first." Harold leaned back in his leather chair, his lawyer's mind already processing the implications. "How long has this been going on?" "I'm not sure, but I've found evidence of financial irregularities going back at least a year. Mark's been siphoning money from our business accounts, nearly $180,000 so far." "Embezzlement." Harold's voice was flat, professional. "That changes everything. We're not just talking about a divorce here. We're talking about criminal charges." I pulled out a manila folder, thick with printed bank statements, transaction records, and signature authorizations. I spent all night gathering this. Mark's been forging my electronic signature to authorize transfers. Some of them happened when I was documented to be hundreds of miles away on job sites. Harold put on his reading glasses and began examining the documents with the methodical precision that had made him one of Chicago's most respected business attorneys. The office fell silent except for the whisper of papers being turned and the distant hum of traffic 32 floors below. "This is substantial," he said finally. "More than substantial. This is ironclad evidence of systematic fraud. David, why didn't you come to me sooner?" "Because I trusted them." The admission tasted bitter. "Sarah's been our bookkeeper since the beginning. Mark's been my business partner for 3 years. I never thought to look for theft from my own family." Harold removed his glasses and fixed me with the same look he'd given opposing counsel in 100 courtrooms. "What do you want to do about this?" I want justice, not revenge, justice. I want them to face the consequences of their choices. And the marriage? The marriage died yesterday afternoon. I just haven't buried it yet. Harold nodded slowly, understanding passing between us like a current. We'd both seen enough of the world to know that some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness. Here's what we're going to do, he said, reaching for a legal pad. First, we're going to secure your assets. I'll file for emergency injunctions to freeze all joint accounts pending divorce proceedings. That stops any further theft immediately. His pen moved across the paper with surgical precision, creating a legal roadmap through the wreckage of my marriage. Second, we're going to gather more evidence. I want you to document everything, every meeting, every transaction, every lie. Keep a journal, save emails, record conversations if Illinois law permits. I've already started, I said, thinking of the notebook I'd begun keeping that morning. Good. Third, we're going to let them hang themselves. Don't confront them yet. Don't change your behavior. Let them think they're getting away with it while we build an airtight case. Harold paused in his writing, looking up at me with something that might have been admiration. You know, David, most men in your situation would be screaming for blood right now. They'd confront the wife, beat up the brother, make a mess that would take years to clean up in court. But you're thinking strategically. That's going to serve you well. I learned a long time ago that the best structures are built on solid foundations, I said. If we're going to bring them down, we need to do it right. Harold smiled for the first time since I'd walked into his office. They picked the wrong man to betray. Sarah and Mark are about to discover that the husband and brother they thought was a pushover is actually a master builder, and he knows exactly how to demolish what needs to come down. We spent the next 2 hours planning my legal strategy with the same meticulous attention to detail I'd used to design a skyscraper. Every angle considered, every potential weakness reinforced, every possible escape route sealed off. By the time I left Harold's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced since discovering the affair. Confidence. Not the blind confidence of denial, but the steady assurance that comes from having a plan. Sarah and Mark thought they were playing checkers, moving pieces randomly across a board they didn't understand. They had no idea I'd been playing chess all along. Harold walked me to the elevator, his hand on my shoulder in a gesture of friendship that went back 3 decades. David, he said as the elevator doors slid open. They handed you every tool you need to dismantle their lives legally. They just don't know it yet. As the elevator carried me back to street level, I looked out at the city through the glass walls. A city I'd helped build with my own hands, beam by beam, contract by contract. I'd built my life the same way, piece by careful piece, and I'd be damned if I was going to let 2 people destroy it without a fight. The war had begun, and I was finally armed for battle. The Riverside construction site buzzed with activity under the late morning sun as I pulled my truck alongside the trailer that served as our temporary office. This was the project that would define Miller Construction's next decade. A luxury apartment complex worth $3.2 million, our biggest contract to date. Mark's Silverado sat parked at an angle that blocked access to the equipment shed, typical of his careless approach to everything. Through the trailer's windows, I could see him hunched over blueprints, his thick fingers tracing lines he probably couldn't read properly. I'd given him authority over this project 3 months ago, back when I'd still bet. Believed family loyalty meant something. Now I watched him with the clinical detachment of a general observing enemy troop movements. "Morning, Mark," I called out as I entered the trailer, noting how he quickly covered certain documents with others. "David." His voice carried that forced enthusiasm I now recognized as guilt trying to masquerade as competence. "Didn't expect you back from Chicago so soon. Flight got in early. Thought I'd check on how things are progressing." Mark gestured toward the windows overlooking the construction site where our crew was laying foundation footings for the building's east wing. "Right on schedule. Maybe even a little ahead." It was a lie, and we both knew it. The foundation work was at least 2 days behind, and I could see stress fractures in the concrete that would need to be repaired before we could proceed to the next phase. But I nodded approvingly, making mental notes for the journal I'd started keeping. "That's great to hear. The Peterson Group is very pleased with our progress reports." Mark's eyes lit up at the mention of money, just as Sarah's had the night before. "Speaking of which, we're going to need to authorize some additional material purchases. The concrete supplier wants payment up front for the next delivery." "How much?" $35,000. "I can handle the paperwork if you want to sign the authorization." I pretended to consider this, watching Mark's face carefully. $35,000 for concrete that would probably cost $20,000, with the difference disappearing into his personal account, just like the previous thefts. Let me review the supplier invoices first, I said. I want to make sure we're getting competitive pricing. Something flickered across Mark's expression. Disappointment, perhaps, or frustration that his latest scheme had been delayed. Sure. I'll get you those invoices. H. He shuffled through papers on his desk with the theatrical efficiency of a man trying to look busy. Oh, and Sarah stopped by earlier. Said she was in the neighborhood after her yoga class. My blood chilled, but I kept my expression neutral. Did she need something? Just wanted to see how the project was coming along. You know how she likes to stay involved in the business side of things. Sarah had never shown interest in active construction sites. She preferred the clean environment of our main office, the finished projects where she could visualize profit margins without getting dust on her shoes. But I knew why she'd really been here. Through the trailer window, I watched our foreman, Jimmy Rodriguez, directing the concrete crew. Jimmy had worked for me for 8 years, a reliable man with an eye for quality and a loyalty that ran deep. If something was happening on this site that I needed to know about, Jimmy would have seen it. I'm going to walk the site, I told Mark. Check on the foundation work. Want me to come with you? No need. You focus on getting me those invoices. Outside, the October air carried the familiar sense of a construction site. Diesel exhaust, fresh concrete, the metallic tang of rebar. I made my way across the uneven ground toward where Jimmy was consulting with the concrete crew, but my real attention was focused on the trailer behind me. Through my peripheral vision, I saw Mark reach for his cell phone the moment he thought I was out of earshot. Jimmy? I called out, approaching my foreman with the casual stride of a boss checking on routine work. Mr. Miller? Jimmy pulled off his hard hat, revealing graying hair and a face weathered by 30 years of outdoor work. How was Chicago? Productive. How are we looking here? Jimmy's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. We're managing, sir. Though I have to say, some of the material orders have been unusual. Unusual how? Well, we've been getting premium grade supplies for some applications where standard grade would be more than sufficient, and the quantities. No, Jimmy shrugged. Sometimes we order more than we use, sometimes less than we need. Translation: Mark was ordering expensive materials to inflate invoices, then selling the excess on the side while leaving the crew short when they needed to maintain quality standards. I appreciate you keeping an eye on things, Jimmy. If you notice any other irregularities, I want you to call me directly. Here's my personal cell. I handed him a business card with my number written on the back. Jimmy tucked it into his shirt pocket with the solemn care of a man who understood the significance of the gesture. There is one other thing, Mr. Miller. Jimmy glanced toward the trailer, then stepped closer to lower his voice. Your wife was here earlier, but she wasn't alone. Oh? Mark introduced her to some guy. Real estate investor, he said. They were looking at the plans, talking about unit layouts and pricing. Seemed pretty friendly. My chest tightened. Sarah was already shopping our project to potential buyers, probably getting kickbacks for insider information about pricing and availability. Did you catch the investor's name? Something like Davidson or Donaldson. Drove a black Mercedes, looked like money. I thanked Jimmy and continued my tour of the site, noting every detail, every shortcut, every sign of mismanagement that I could document later. Mark was systematically undermining the project while Sarah fed information to third parties who could profit from our work. But they were also creating a paper trail that would ultimately destroy them. When I returned to the trailer, Mark was off the phone and trying to look busy with genuine work. Everything looks good out there, I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. Jimmy's crew is doing excellent work. Yeah, Jimmy's solid, one of the best foremen we've ever had. He mentioned you've been making some changes to our material orders. Mark's hand paused over the papers he was shuffling. Just trying to optimize our supply chain, get better prices, improve quality. I appreciate the initiative. In fact, I'm so impressed with how you're handling this project that I want to give you even more responsibility. Mark's eyes widened with what I'm sure he thought was opportunity, but was actually the sound of the trap closing around him. I'm putting you in charge of the Westfield Shopping Center renovation as well. It's a $500,000 contract, and I think you're ready for that level of responsibility. David, that's incredible. Thank you. Don't thank me yet. Both projects need to come in on time and under budget. Our reputation depends on it. Mark's smile faltered slightly as the weight of actual responsibility settled on his shoulders. Managing one project while skimming money was challenging enough. Managing two while maintaining the facade of competence would be nearly impossible. But that was exactly what I was counting on. I have complete confidence in you, I said, standing to leave. After all, family has to stick together, right? As I drove away from the construction site, I caught a glimpse of Mark in my rearview mirror, standing outside the trailer with his phone pressed to his ear again. He was probably calling Sarah to celebrate their expanded opportunities for theft. They thought they were playing checkers while I'd been playing chess. The $500,000 contract they were about to steal would be their checkmate. But first, I needed to document everything. Every phone call, every suspicious meeting, every financial irregularity would become another link in the chain that would ultimately bind them. The trap was set. Now all I had to do was wait for them to spring it on themselves. Moretti's was the kind of upscale restaurant where Chicago's business elite celebrated deals and discussed acquisitions over $30 steaks and $100 bottles of wine. From my position at the mahogany bar, nursing a single malt scotch I couldn't taste, I had a perfect view of the corner table where my wife and brother were toasting their perceived victory. Sarah had chosen a red dress I bought her for last year's Christmas party, the one that had made every head turn when we'd walked into the office gathering together. The irony wasn't lost on me. She was celebrating the destruction of our marriage while wearing a gift from the man she was destroying. Mark had actually attempted to dress up for the occasion, trading his usual work clothes for a navy blazer that was probably the most expensive item in his closet. But no amount of styling could disguise what he was, a small-time schemer who'd stumbled into a bigger game than he understood. "To new beginnings," Sarah said, raising her wine glass in a toast that carried across the restaurant's ambient noise. "To finally getting what we deserve," Mark replied, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd outsmarted everyone around him. They had no idea I was 20 feet away, watching their celebration while planning their destruction. The past 2 weeks had been a masterclass in strategic patience. I'd given Mark increasing responsibility while documenting every mistake, every theft, every sign of his fundamental incompetence. The Westfield project was already showing stress fractures under his management. Delayed deliveries, budget overruns, and quality issues that would have destroyed my reputation if I hadn't been quietly managing damage control behind the scenes. Meanwhile, Sarah had grown bolder in her deceptions. Her yoga classes now occurred 3 times a week, always coinciding with Mark's lunch breaks. She'd started spending money more freely, purchasing items she claimed were good investments or necessary upgrades to our home. Yesterday, I discovered she'd opened a credit card in our joint names and run up $18,000 in charges over the past 2 months. Jewelry, clothes, hotel rooms paid for with money that legally belonged to both of us but morally belonged to neither of them. But the most damaging evidence had come from an unexpected source. Jimmy Rodriguez had called me that morning with information that would have been devastating if I'd still harbored any illusions about my wife's loyalty. "Mr. Miller," he'd said, his voice tight with discomfort, "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but I thought you should know. Your wife was at the Riverside site again yesterday, and she wasn't just showing it to that investor." "What do you mean?" She was giving him detailed information about our costs, our profit margins, even our future project pipeline. And sir, they were talking about starting their own construction company. The pieces had fallen into place with crystalline clarity. Sarah and Mark weren't just stealing money from Miller Construction. They were planning to steal the entire business model, using insider information to undercut our bids and poach our clients. Now watching them celebrate what they believed was their master plan, I felt something unexpected: pity. They were so focused on what they thought they were taking that they couldn't see what they were actually losing. Sarah was trading 20 years of marriage to a man who'd built an empire for a few stolen months with a man who'd never successfully managed anything more complex than a fast food job. Mark was risking his freedom and his family relationships for money he was too incompetent to even steal efficiently. "Another scotch?" the bartender asked, noticing my empty glass. "Please, and put whatever they're having on my tab," I said, nodding toward Sarah and Mark's table. The bartender followed my ahs and raised an eyebrow. "You know them?" "I used to." 20 minutes later, a server approached their table with a bottle of champagne I'd sent over. Dom Perignon, 2008, the same vintage from my wedding day. I watched Sarah's confusion turn to delight as she realized what she was drinking, probably assuming Mark had managed to afford such an extravagant gesture. Mark looked equally puzzled but accepted the credit, raising his glass with the pompous satisfaction of a man who believed he deserved such luxury. They had no idea their celebration was being funded by the man they were betraying. My phone buzzed with a text from Harold. "Emergency injunctions approved. All joint accounts frozen as of tomorrow morning. How are you holding up?" I typed back, "Watching them dig their own graves. It's almost sad." Justice often is. Stay strong. As I settled my bar tab and prepared to leave, I caught fragments of Sarah and Mark's conversation drifting over the restaurant's noise. Once we have the client list, we can undercut every bid by 15%. David will never see it coming until it's too late. Finally going to get everything we've worked for. Everything we've worked for. The phrase echoed in my mind as I walked out into the Chicago night. They actually believed they'd worked for what they were stealing. 20 years of my 16-hour days, my strategic planning, my relationship building with clients and suppliers, they thought they deserved credit for that. But their arrogance would be their downfall. Tomorrow morning, when Sarah tried to access our accounts and found them frozen, the first crack would appear in their house of cards. When Mark tried to authorize payments for his inflated invoices and discovered his electronic access had been revoked, the structure would begin to shake. And when the forensic accountants Harold had hired finished their investigation into every financial transaction over the past 2 years, the entire edifice would come crashing down. As they clinked glasses celebrating their new life, they had no idea I'd already secured every asset, every contract, every bridge they thought they could burn. The trap was closing, and they were too drunk on their own perceived cleverness to notice the walls closing in around them. Soon, very soon, they would discover the difference between thinking you're smart and actually being intelligent. The lesson was going to cost them everything. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would forever divide my life into before and after. Sarah's voice carried across our bedroom with a pitch of panic I'd never heard in 20 years of marriage. David! David, wake up! Something's wrong with our accounts! I sat up slowly, rubbing my eyes with the theatrical confusion of a man genuinely puzzled by unexpected news. What do you mean, something's wrong? Sarah stood by our bedroom window, laptop balanced on her palm, her face illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. She wore the silk pajamas I'd bought her for Mother's Day, and her hair fell in waves around her shoulders. She looked beautiful and desperate and completely unaware that she was holding the evidence of her own destruction. I can't access any of our joint accounts. It says they're frozen pending legal review. David, what's going on? Frozen? I swung my legs out of bed, bare feet hitting the cold hardwood floor. That doesn't make sense. Let me see. I took the laptop and made a show of scrolling through the banking interface, watching Sarah's growing panic reflect in the screen's surface. Every account we'd built together over 2 decades, checking, savings, business operating funds, even the college fund we'd established for our daughter, all locked down tighter than a maximum security prison. Maybe it's a computer error, I said, handing the laptop back to her. These things happen with online bank. You think I'll call Harold first thing this morning and see if he can sort it out? Sarah's relief was visible, her shoulders sagging as she accepted the reasonable explanation I'd offered. She had no way of knowing that Harold had been the one to file the emergency injunctions that had frozen every penny. Thank God, she breathed. I was worried someone had stolen our identity or something. Someone had, I thought. Just not in the way you're imagining. My phone rang as Sarah disappeared into the bathroom to shower. Mark's number appeared on the caller ID and I could practically hear the panic in his voice before I answered. David, we've got a problem at the construction site. The concrete supplier is refusing delivery because our account shows insufficient funds. Insufficient funds? That's impossible. We have over $200,000 in our operating account. That's what I thought. But they're saying the account's been frozen by court order. What the hell is going on? I let a note of genuine concern creep into my voice. Sarah was just telling me about problems with our personal accounts too. Some kind of freeze on all our joint holdings. I'm calling Harold as soon as his office opens. Jesus, David, if we can't pay suppliers, the whole project shuts down. We'll be in breach of contract with Peterson Group. Let me make some calls. Maybe we can arrange temporary financing until this gets sorted out. Mark's relief was audible. Thank God you're staying calm about this. I was starting to panic. You should be panicking, I thought. This is just the beginning. The next few hours unfolded with the precision of a Swiss watch. Harold's office discovered the problem with our accounts and assured us that his team was working diligently to resolve what appeared to be some kind of bureaucratic mix-up. Sarah spent the morning on the phone with bank representatives who could tell her nothing beyond the fact that the accounts were frozen pending legal proceedings. Her frustration mounted with each call, her voice growing sharper as she realized that none of her charm or indignation could unlock the money she'd grown accustomed to accessing freely. Mark, meanwhile, was dealing with increasingly angry suppliers and subcontractors. Without access to operating funds, he couldn't pay for materials or labor, and the construction site ground to a halt like a machine stripped of its gears. By noon, he was at our house, pacing across our living room carpet like a caged animal. "This is a disaster, David." The electrical contractor walked off the job. "The concrete crew is threatening to file a lien. If we don't get money flowing by tomorrow, we're going to lose the Peterson contract." I sat in my leather recliner, projecting the calm authority that had served me well in 2 decades of business crises. "What about your personal accounts? Surely you have some reserves we can use for bridge financing." Mark's face flushed red. "My personal accounts, they don't have nearly enough to cover what we need." Of course they didn't. Mark had been stealing money, not saving it. Every dollar he'd embezzled had been spent on toys and luxuries, not invested for emergencies like this. "What about that investor friend of Sarah's, the one she mentioned meeting at the construction site?" Sarah, who'd been silent during Mark's panicked recitation, suddenly looked up from her laptop. "What investor?" Mark shot her a warning look, but it was too late. I'd already caught the slip. "The real estate investor you were showing around the Riverside project, Davidson, I think his name was." Sarah's face went pale. That was just a casual tour. He was interested in purchasing a unit when the project's completed." "Right," I said, making a mental note for the journal I'd been keeping. "Well, maybe he'd be interested in providing short-term financing, if he's planning to buy into the project anyway." "I don't think he's that kind of investor," Sarah said quickly. "He's more focused on finished properties." The lie hung in the air between us like smoke from a house fire. My phone rang, providing a welcome interruption to the growing tension. Harold's name appeared on the caller ID, and I answered with the eagerness of a man desperate for good news. "David, I'm afraid I have some disturbing information about your account freeze." I put the phone on speaker so Sarah and Mark could hear. "What kind of information?" "It appears the freeze was triggered by suspicious financial activity. Large transfers that don't match your normal business patterns. The bank's fraud detection system flagged multiple transactions as potentially unauthorized." Sarah's laptop slipped from her hands, clattering onto the coffee table. Mark's pacing stopped abruptly. "Unauthorized transactions?" I said. "Harold, I authorize every major transfer personally." That's what I told them, but they're saying some of these transfers appear to have been made with forged electronic signatures. "David, I hate to ask this, but do you know of anyone who might have access to your business accounts? Anyone who might have been making unauthorized transfers?" The silence in our living room was deafening. I looked from Sarah to Mark, watching the blood drain from their faces as they realized what Harold was implying. I can't imagine who would do such a thing," I said slowly. "I mean, the only people with account access are Sarah and Mark, and they would never—" "Of course not," Harold said. "But David, if there's been systematic embezzlement, we're looking at serious criminal charges. The FBI might get involved." Mark made a sound like a wounded animal. Sarah's hands trembled as she reached for her coffee cup. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked. "Preliminary investigation suggests somewhere in the neighborhood of $200,000 over the past year." The coffee cup slipped from Sarah's nerveless fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor in a spray of ceramic shards and dark liquid. When Sarah accused me of orchestrating their downfall later that afternoon, when the full weight of their situation had finally penetrated their panic, I looked her in the eye and said, "Sweetheart, you did this to yourselves. I just stopped cleaning up your messes." The truth of those words hung between us like a death sentence. They'd built their house of cards with stolen money and broken promises, and now they were discovering what happened when the foundation finally gave way. The collapse had only just begun. The Cook County Courthouse stood like a granite monument to justice in downtown Chicago, its neoclassical columns casting long shadows across the steps where I'd met Harold on dozens of occasions over the years. But this morning was different. This morning, I wasn't here to negotiate contracts or settle business disputes. This morning, I was here to end a marriage and destroy the 2 people who'd betrayed everything I'd built. Harold met me at the courthouse entrance, his silver hair gleaming under the autumn sun, carrying a leather briefcase that contained 20 years of financial records, documented lies, and photographic evidence of adultery that would make even a seasoned divorce judge wince. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, studying my face with the concern of a friend who'd watched me build an empire and now had to help me dismantle the personal life that had been stolen from me. "I've been ready since the day I caught them," I replied, straightening my tie, the same navy silk tie Sarah had given me for our 15th anniversary, worn today as a reminder of how thoroughly she'd betrayed the man who'd loved her. Inside, the courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, its wood-paneled walls and fluorescent lighting lending an air of bureaucratic finality to what had once been sacred vows. Sarah sat at the defendant's table with her attorney, a sharp-faced woman named Jennifer Walsh, who specialized in protecting cheating spouses from the financial consequences of their infidelity. Sarah had lost weight over the past month since the accounts were frozen, her face gaunt with stress and sleepless nights. She wore a conservative black dress that I'd never seen before, probably purchased with the emergency credit card she'd hidden from me, the one Harold's investigators had discovered and documented as part of her systematic financial deception. Mark wasn't present. He was downtown at the federal building, dealing with the criminal charges that had been filed against him 3 days earlier. Wire fraud, embezzlement, identity theft, crimes that carried federal prison sentences measured in years, not months. Judge Patricia Morrison called the court to order with the sharp rap of her gavel, and the formal dissolution of my marriage began. Harold stood and addressed the court with the measured authority that had made him one of Chicago's most respected attorneys. Your Honor, this case involves not just the breakdown of a marriage, but the systematic theft of assets by both the defendant and her co-conspirator, the defendant's brother-in-law. He opened his briefcase and began presenting evidence with the methodical precision of a master craftsman. Bank records showing the unauthorized transfers. Photographs of Sarah and Mark taken by the private investigator I'd hired. Hotel receipts charged to business accounts. Forged signature authorizations that handwriting experts had authenticated. But the most devastating evidence was had to come. Your Honor, I'd like to introduce Exhibit J, recordings of conversations between the defendant and her co-conspirator, recorded legally in accordance with Illinois one-party consent statutes. My phone had been recording every conversation I'd had with Sarah and Mark for the past month. Conversations where they'd discussed their plans to steal my business, their calculations of how much money they could siphon before I noticed, their mockery of my trust and gullibility. The courtroom fell silent as Harold played excerpts from those recordings through the court's audio system. Sarah's voice discussing with Mark how much money they could steal before I became suspicious. David's so focused on the big picture he never pays attention to small transfers. We could take $50,000 and he wouldn't notice for months. Mark's voice planning their new business. Once we have enough capital, we can start our own construction company. David trained me for years. I know all his methods, all his contacts. Sarah again, with casual cruelty that cut deeper than any physical blow. The marriage has been over for years anyway. David's just too stupid to realize it. At least this way, I'll get something out of the 20 years I wasted on him. I watched Sarah's face crumble as her own words condemned her. Across the courtroom, her attorney whispered urgently in her ear, probably advising her to accept whatever settlement Harold was prepared to offer. But Harold wasn't finished. Your Honor, the defendant didn't just betray her marriage vows. She betrayed her fiduciary duty as a business partner. She used her access to confidential financial information to facilitate fraud. She opened credit accounts in her husband's name without his knowledge. She conspired to steal trade secrets and client lists with the intent of destroying the business she'd helped to build. Judge Morrison Stu dyed the evidence with the careful attention of a woman who'd seen every form of human betrayal, but was still capable of being shocked by its depth. Mrs. Miller, she said, addressing Sarah directly, do you wish to contest any of these allegations? Sarah's attorney leaned over to whisper something, but Sarah shook her head and stood on unsteady legs. No, Your Honor, she said, her voice barely audible. I made mistakes. Terrible mistakes. Mistakes? Harold's voice carried across the courtroom like a whip crack. Your Honor, these weren't mistakes. They were calculated acts of betrayal spanning more than a year. The defendant didn't accidentally embezzle nearly $200,000. She didn't accidentally commit adultery in the marital home. She didn't accidentally conspire to destroy her husband's business. Judge Morrison's gavel fell with finality. In the matter of Miller versus Miller, I find for the plaintiff. Mrs. Miller, you are hereby stripped of all claims to marital assets acquired during the marriage. You will receive no alimony, no share of the business, and no claim to the marital home. Sarah collapsed back into her chair as if she'd been physically struck. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. Furthermore, I'm ordering full restitution of all embezzled funds, plus punitive damages. Mrs. Miller, your actions represent a particularly egregious form of betrayal, and this court will not reward such behavior with financial compensation. The gavel fell again, and 20 years of marriage died with the sound of wood striking wood. As we filed out of the courtroom, Sarah caught up with me in the hallway, her face streaked with tears and desperation. David, please, she said, grabbing my arm with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves. We were married for 20 years. Doesn't that mean anything to you? I looked down at her. This woman I'd loved completely. This woman who'd shared my bed while planning my destruction and felt nothing but pity. It meant everything to me, I said quietly. That's why what you did was unforgivable. I walked away without looking back, leaving her standing in the courthouse hallway with the wreckage of her choices scattered around her like broken glass. The judge's gavel had fallen like thunder, and 20 years of lies had crumbled in an afternoon. But the real justice was yet to come. The Miller Construction office building had been my pride for 15 years, 3 stories of steel and glass overlooking the Chicago River, with floor-to-ceiling windows that caught the morning light and scattered it across conference rooms where million-dollar deals were negotiated. I designed every detail myself, from the exposed brick walls that honored our construction heritage to the hardwood floors that whispered success under the feet of clients and employees. Now standing in my corner office on the 3rd floor, I watched Mark load cardboard boxes into the back of a rusted pickup truck that wasn't even his anymore. The Silverado had been repossessed 3 days earlier, along with his apartment, his furniture, and every toy he'd bought with stolen money. The federal marshals had finished their work an hour ago, seizing Mark's company computer, his files, and anything else that might serve as evidence in his criminal trial. His office, the one I'd given him when I'd still believed family loyalty meant something, sat empty except for the indentations in the carpet where his desk had stood. Mr. Miller? My secretary, Janet, appeared in the doorway with the careful deference of someone who'd watched her boss's personal life explode in spectacular fashion, but was too professional to comment on it. There's someone here to see you. Mark stood behind her, his face gaunt with the hollow-eyed desperation of a man who'd bet everything on a bad hand and lost. He wore the same clothes he'd had on due. During his arrest, jeans and a wrinkled flannel shirt that smelled of desperation and cheap aftershave. It's okay, Janet, send him in. Mark entered my office like a condemned man approaching the gallows, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his eyes avoiding the family photographs that still lined my desk, images from happier times when I'd believed he was actually family, instead of just a thief who shared my last name. David, he said, his voice cracking like a teenager's. I know I don't have the right to ask, but... You're right, I interrupted, not looking up from the contract I was reviewing. You don't have the right to ask for anything. I'm facing 10 years in federal prison. You're facing the consequences of your choices. Mark moved closer to my desk, and I caught the scent of fierce sweat and unwashed clothes. David, please. I'm your brother. We grew up together. You taught me how to use tools, how to read blueprints. Doesn't that count for something? I finally looked up at him, really looked at him, and saw not the successful businessman I'd tried to create, but the same selfish child who'd stolen my bicycle when we were kids, who'd borrowed money he never repaid, who'd always taken shortcuts and expected others to clean up his messes. You want to know what counts? I set down my pen and leaned back in my leather chair. What counts is that I gave you every opportunity to succeed. I brought you into my company when no one else would hire you. I made you a partner when you hadn't earned it. I trusted you with my life's work, and you repaid that trust by stealing from me and sleeping with my wife. Mark's face crumpled. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. Sarah and I. It just sort of developed over time. And the money. I was going to pay it back once we got the new company established. You were going to pay back money you stole by using it to sue. Compete against me? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mark, even your apologies are lies. I'm sorry, David. I'm so sorry for everything. No, you're not. You're sorry you got caught. You're sorry you're facing prison time. You're sorry your schemes collapsed. But you're not sorry for betraying me, because if you could do it all again and get away with it, you would. Mark opened his mouth to protest, but I held up a hand to stop him. I know you, Mark. I've known you for 47 years. You've never taken responsibility for anything in your life. Even now, standing in my office after destroying everything I built with Sarah, you're looking for someone else to blame. Someone else to fix your problems. What do you want me to say? I want you to say nothing. I want you to take your boxes and get out of my building. I want you to serve your time and then disappear from my life forever. Mark's shoulders sagged as the finality of my words hit him. David, I'm still your brother. No, I said, returning to my contract. Brothers don't steal from each other. Brothers don't betray each other. You're just a man who used to be my brother before you chose money over family. I heard his footsteps retreat across the hardwood floor, heard the elevator chime as it carried him down to the lobby and out of my life. Through my office window, I watched him load the last of his boxes into the borrowed pickup truck. He moved slowly like an old man, though he was only 44. Prison would age him further, I knew. Federal inmates didn't fare well, especially ones convicted of white-collar crimes. My phone buzzed with a text message from Sarah. David, I know you won't take my calls, but I need you to know I never meant for things to go this far. I never wanted to hurt you. Can we please talk? I deleted the message without responding. Sarah had been calling and texting for weeks, ever since the divorce settlement left her with nothing but debt and the clothes she'd been wearing when the sheriff's deputies escorted her from our house. She'd moved in with her sister in Milwaukee, taken a job at a department store, traded her BMW for a used Honda that leaked oil in the parking lot. Harold had shown me the surveillance photos his investigator had taken. Sarah in her polyester uniform helping customers find discounted shoes, her face drawn with the exhaustion that comes from working retail after 20 years of being supported by someone else's success. Part of me, a very small part, felt sorry for her, but a larger part remembered her voice on those recordings, mocking my trust, planning my destruction, referring to our 20-year marriage as time she'd wasted on me. Some betrayals cut too deep for forgiveness. As Mark's borrowed truck disappeared around the corner, I turned back to my desk and the future I was building from the wreckage of my personal life. Miller Construction would survive, would thrive actually, without the drag of embezzlement and mismanagement that had been slowly bleeding us dry. I'd hired Elena Vasquez as my new project manager, a brilliant architect with an MBA from Northwestern who understood both the creative and business sides of construction. She was talented, honest, and refreshingly direct in her communications, qualities I'd learned to value more than I'd ever imagined. The Peterson Group project had been completed on time and under budget once I'd removed Mark from the equation. 3 more major contracts had followed, worth a combined $8.2 million. Miller Construction was stronger than it had ever been. As they drove away in Mark's repossessed truck, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. They'd traded everything real for a lie, and now they were discovering the true cost of their choices. The autumn light through my office windows was already growing longer, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Soon it would be winter, and then spring, and I would still be here, building things that mattered, surrounded by people who understood the value of honest work and genuine loyalty. Mark and Sarah were ghosts now, haunting only their own memories. I had more important things to build. 6 months later, I stood on a hill overlooking the construction site that would become the Sarah Henderson Community Center, named for Harold's late wife, a woman who dedicated her life to helping disadvantaged children find opportunities for success. The recovered funds from Mark's embezzlement, combined with matching donations from local businesses, had made this project possible. The morning sun painted the partially completed building in shades of gold and amber, its steel framework reaching toward a cloudless sky like the skeleton of something hopeful being born. Elena Vasquez stood beside me, architectural plans rolled under her arm, her dark hair catching the light as she pointed out details of the structure we were creating together. The gymnasium should be finished by Christmas, she said, her voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who understood that buildings were more than just steel and concrete. They were dreams made manifest. The after-school program can begin operating in January. Elena was 42, divorced with 2 teenage daughters who'd inherited their mother's intelligence and determination. She joined Miller Construction 4 months ago, after Mark's arrest, bringing 15 years of architectural experience and a project management style that emphasized collaboration over competition. Working with her felt like partnership in the truest sense. 2 professionals combining their strengths to create something neither could have built alone. The City Planning Commission approved the expansion plans, I said, unrolling the blueprints Elena had prepared. We can break ground on the Technology Center next spring. Your donation will help a lot of kids, David. Elena turned to face me, and I caught the scent of her perfume. Something subtle and professional, nothing like the cloying sweetness Sarah had favored. This community has needed something like this for years. The donation had been substantial. $300,000 of the money recovered from Mark's theft, funds that could have gone toward expanding Miller Construction or purchasing new equipment. But I'd learned something in the months since my divorce. Money meant nothing if it wasn't used to build something meaningful. Elena's presence in my life had taught me other lessons as well. We'd had dinner together twice in the past month, professional meetings that had evolved into something more personal, though neither of us had acknowledged the change explicitly. Elena was cautious about workplace relationships, and I was still learning to trust again after 20 years of betrayal. But there was something building between us. as carefully constructed as any foundation we'd ever poured. "Elena," I said, studying her profile as she reviewed the blueprints, "would you like to have dinner tonight? Somewhere that serves better food than the construction site trailer?" She looked up at me with a smile that was part surprise, part invitation. "I thought you'd never ask." My phone buzzed with a text message and I glanced at the screen out of habit. Sarah's number appeared, along with a message I'd seen variations of dozens of times over the past 6 months. "David, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know I think about our good times every day. I'm sorry for everything." I deleted the message without reading it completely and turned my phone face down on the hood of my truck. "Everything okay?" Elena asked, noticing my momentary distraction. "Just ghosts," I said. "Nothing important." The truth was, Sarah and Mark had become footnotes in a story I was no longer interested in telling. Mark was serving an 8-year federal sentence in a minimum security prison in Pennsylvania, learning what happened when schemes replaced hard work. Sarah was still working retail in Milwaukee, living in a studio apartment and driving a 12-year-old Honda that needed constant repairs. According to Harold, who still occasionally updated me on their situations, they'd both tried to contact me through intermediaries, former friends, distant relatives, even Sarah's divorce attorney, hoping to negotiate some kind of financial settlement or personal reconciliation. I'd declined every overture. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. Some trust, once broken, couldn't be repaired. Some betrayals cut so deep that forgiveness became less important than simply moving forward. Elena and I spent the rest of the morning walking the construction site, discussing timeline adjustments and budget allocations with the easy collaboration of two people who shared similar values and complementary skills. She asked intelligent questions, offered practical suggestions, and demonstrated the kind of professional competence that made difficult projects seem manageable. More importantly, she treated me like a partner rather than a provider, like someone whose opinions mattered rather than someone whose wallet needed to be managed. By noon, we'd finalized the community center's completion schedule and begun preliminary planning for the technology center expansion. As we drove back toward the Miller construction offices, Elena turned to me with the directness I'd come to appreciate. "David, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "Do you ever regret how you handled the situation with your ex-wife and brother? Part of me wonders if you could have found a way to forgive them, to rebuild those relationships." I considered the question while navigating downtown Chicago traffic, watching pedestrians hurry along sidewalks past buildings I'd helped construct over the past 2 decades. "Elena, I learned something important during that whole nightmare. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring that actions have consequences. I didn't destroy Sarah and Mark. I simply stopped protecting them from the results of their choices. But they were family. Family isn't defined by blood or marriage certificates. Family is defined by loyalty, by trust, by the willingness to build something together instead of tearing it down for personal gain. Sarah and Mark weren't family. They were parasites who used family connections to justify their betrayal." Elena nodded slowly, understanding flickering in her eyes. "So you don't regret cutting ties with them?" "I regret that they forced me to make that choice, but I don't regret making it." That evening, Elena and I had dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Lincoln Park, sharing stories about our children, our careers, our hopes for the future. She talked about her daughter's college plans and her own dreams of designing sustainable housing for low-income families. I found myself describing projects I wanted to build, communities I wanted to serve, legacies I wanted to leave behind. For the first time in months, I felt genuinely optimistic about the future. As I drove home that night, past the downtown buildings that bore the Miller Construction nameplate, I reflected on the lessons I'd learned from betrayal and recovery. Trust, once broken, was almost impossible to rebuild, but it was entirely possible to find new people worthy of trust. Love, once betrayed, left scars that never fully healed, but those scars could serve as reminders to choose more carefully the next time. Success, once threatened, could be rebuilt. It's stronger than before if you were willing to let go of what needed to be discarded and focus on what deserved to be preserved. The community center would be completed by Christmas, serving children who needed safe spaces to learn and grow. Miller Construction would continue expanding, building structures that improve people's lives rather than just generating profit. And I would continue learning to trust again, one careful step at a time, with someone who understood the difference between building something together and taking something apart. Justice isn't about revenge. It's about ensuring actions have consequences. I didn't destroy Sarah and Mark. I simply stopped protecting them from themselves. Sometimes the best revenge is living well, honorably, and surrounded by people who understand the value of integrity. Sometimes the best victory is the one that builds something better from the wreckage of what came before. And sometimes the most important lesson is learning to recognize the difference between those who deserve your trust and those who've proven they don't. If you've made it this far, I want to know, have you ever had to choose between forgiveness and justice? Have you ever discovered that someone you trusted completely was betraying you behind your back? Share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your experiences help others who might be facing similar choices. And if you believe that integrity and patience are more powerful weapons than anger and revenge, hit that like button. Sometimes the strongest response to betrayal isn't striking back, it's simply stepping back and letting people face the consequences of their own actions. Until next time, remember, the best foundations are built on truth, and the strongest structures are the ones that can weather any storm.